Margaret Hayes stood in the doorway of the American Legion Hall in Pinewood, Virginia, holding a cardboard box that contained 37 years of her military life. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and she could hear voices inside, loud, dismissive voices that made her stomach tighten. She was 62 years old, with silver hair cut short and practical, and hands that still knew how to field strip a rifle in under a minute. Those hands trembled now, not from age or weakness, but from something she hadn't felt in decades, the sting of being invisible. Margaret had served her country with honor. She'd enlisted in 1982, when women in the military were still fighting for respect at every turn. She'd worked her way up through the ranks, served in Desert Storm, and spent 15 years training new recruits. She'd retired as a master sergeant, with medals she never talked about and scars she never showed. When she'd moved back to Pinewood last year, she thought she'd finally come home. The town had changed, but the Legion Hall was still there, a place where veterans gathered, where service meant something, where she thought she'd belong. She'd been wrong. Margaret pushed open the door. Inside, a dozen men sat around tables, some playing cards, others watching a football game on the old television mounted in the corner. The smell of coffee and old wood filled the air. These men were veterans too, from Vietnam, from Korea, even one from World War II. She'd hoped they would see her as one of their own. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "I brought some things for the memorial display." Tom Bradford, the Legion post commander, looked up from his card game. He was a thick-shouldered man in his 70s, with a gray beard and eyes that had always looked past Margaret rather than at her. "What kind of things?" he asked, not bothering to stand. Margaret walked to the display case near the entrance, a glass cabinet that held photographs, medals, and memorabilia from Pinewood's veterans. She opened her box and carefully lifted out her dress uniform jacket. It was olive green, adorned with ribbons and badges that told the story of her service. "I thought my jacket might fit in here," she said quietly, "next to the others." The room went silent. Then someone laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. It was Dale Porter, a Vietnam veteran who'd made it clear from Margaret's first visit that he didn't think women belonged in the military, much less in the Legion Hall. "You've got to be kidding," Dale said, standing up. He was tall and lean, with a face weathered by years and whiskey. "This display is for real combat veterans, for soldiers who actually fought." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I served in Desert Storm, I was." "You were what? A secretary, a cook?" Dale walked closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Women in the military are support staff, honey. You typed reports while men did the dying." "That's not true," Margaret said, keeping her voice level. She'd faced this before 1,000 times, but it never got easier. "I served in a combat support unit. We were." "Combat support," Dale repeated, making the word sound like an insult. "That's not combat. That's sitting safely behind the lines while real soldiers take the bullets." Tom Bradford shifted in his seat but said nothing. The other men looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Margaret felt the familiar weight of isolation settle over her shoulders. "My service was real," Margaret said, louder now. "I earned every one of these ribbons. I earned the right to be here." Dale reached out and plucked the jacket from Margaret's hands before she could react. He held it up, examining it with theatrical disgust. "Look at this," he announced to the room. "Participation trophies. That's all these are. They hand these out to everyone now just for showing up." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "Give that back." "Why, so you can pretend you're a real soldier." Dale turned to Tom. "I say we put this where it belongs, the donation bin. Maybe Goodwill will take it." "That jacket represents my service," Margaret said, her voice shaking now, not with fear, but with rage she'd spent a lifetime learning to control. "My sacrifice. Your sacrifice?" Dale laughed again. "You want to talk about sacrifice? I lost 3 friends in the Mekong Delta. They came home in boxes. You came home with a pension and some shiny pins." Margaret stepped forward. "You don't know what I've—" "I know you weren't there when it counted," Dale interrupted. He walked toward the door, still holding her jacket. "And I know this doesn't belong with the real veterans." Tom Bradford finally stood up. For a moment, Margaret thought he might say something, might defend her right to honor her service. Instead, he just shook his head. "Maybe it's better if you keep your things at home, Margaret," he said quietly. "No sense causing trouble." The words hit harder than Dale's mockery. This was the post commander, a man who should have understood, who should have stood up for a fellow veteran. Instead, he was choosing the easy path, the path that didn't require him to challenge his friends or his own outdated beliefs. Dale opened the door and stepped outside. Margaret followed, her heart pounding. She watched as he walked to a metal barrel behind the building, a burn barrel they used for trash. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Dale looked back at her with a cruel smile. "Taking out the garbage." He tossed her jacket into the barrel. The olive-green fabric settled among the ashes and debris. Then he pulled a lighter from his pocket. "Don't," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." Dale flicked the lighter. The flame caught on a piece of paper in the barrel, and within seconds smoke began to rise. The flames licked at her jacket, blackening the fabric, melting the ribbons, consuming 37 years of service and sacrifice. Margaret stood frozen, watching her past burn. She wanted to scream, to grab the jacket, to do something. But she couldn't move. All she could do was watch as the medals she'd earned, the uniform she'd worn with pride, turned to ash. Dale walked past her, pausing at her shoulder. "This is a place for soldiers," he said quietly, "not for women playing dress-up." He went back inside, leaving Margaret alone with the burning barrel and the smoke that stung her eyes, though not as much as the tears she refused to shed. She stood there for a long time, watching the flames die down, watching her service disappear into nothing. The men inside went back to their card games and their football. No one came to check on her. No one apologized. No one cared. When the fire finally burned out, Margaret reached into the barrel. The metal was still warm. She pulled out what remained of her jacket, charred scraps of fabric, melted ribbons, blackened patches that had once meant something. She put the remains back in her cardboard box and walked to her truck. Her hands were steady again. Her face was calm. But something had changed inside her, something fundamental and irreversible. They thought they'd put her in her place. They thought they'd shown her she didn't belong. They had no idea what they'd actually done. Margaret drove home to the small ranch house she'd bought on the edge of town. It was a simple place, neat and organized, just like the quarters she'd kept during her years of service. She carried the box inside and set it on her kitchen table. Then she went to her bedroom and opened the closet. Behind her civilian clothes, pushed to the back where no one would notice, was a locked metal case. She pulled it out and entered the combination, a sequence of numbers she'd never forgotten, never would forget. Inside the case was everything they'd never asked about, everything she'd never volunteered, everything that told the real story of Master Sergeant Margaret Hayes. She lifted out a different jacket, black, unmarked, made of reinforced fabric designed for operations that didn't officially exist. Beneath it were photographs, documents, and equipment that most soldiers would never see, much less use. Margaret sat on her bed and looked at the photographs. There she was, 20 years younger, standing with a team of soldiers in an undisclosed location. Their faces were hard, their eyes watchful. These weren't support staff. These weren't secretaries or cooks. These were operators, special operations. Margaret had been recruited into a classified program in 1991, right after Desert Storm. She'd shown aptitude, resilience, and the kind of cold-blooded competence that couldn't be taught. For 12 years, she'd been part of missions that would never appear in history books, in places that couldn't be acknowledged, doing work that official soldiers couldn't do. She trained foreign resistance fighters in Eastern Europe. She'd extracted intelligence assets from hostile territory. She'd done things that haunted her sleep and saved countless lives, and she'd done them all in silence because that was the job. When the program ended, she'd gone back to regular service, training recruits and keeping her mouth shut about where she'd been and what she'd done. The military had given her a handful of generic ribbons and told her to be grateful. The real medals, the real recognition, had been classified and locked away forever. And now Dale Porter and Tom Bradford thought she was just another woman who typed reports and served coffee. Margaret stood up and carried the black jacket to her living room. She spread it out on the couch and ran her fingers over the fabric. It still fit. She'd made sure of that, keeping herself in the same shape she'd been in 20 years ago, running 5 miles every morning, training in her garage. She'd told herself it was just habit, just discipline. But deep down, she'd always known the truth. She'd been waiting for a reason to prove herself again, waiting for a moment when the quiet retirement wasn't enough anymore. They'd given her that moment when they burned her jacket. The next morning, Margaret drove to Richmond. The city was 2 hours away, far enough that no one from Pinewood would see her, close enough to get there and back in a day. She had phone calls to make and people to see, people who existed in the shadows of the military world, people who owed her favors. Her first stop was a small office building near the VCU campus. The sign outside read Hartman Security Consulting, but Margaret knew it was a front. Inside, behind the desk of a legitimate security business, was an operation that connected former special operations personnel with work that required their particular skills. A young woman at the front desk looked up as Margaret entered. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see James Hartman," Margaret said. "Tell him Reaper is calling in a marker." The woman's professional smile didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened. "One moment, please." Reaper. Margaret hadn't used that call sign in 15 years. It was the name she'd earned in the classified program, given to her after a mission in Serbia where she'd eliminated 3 targets in a single night, all without raising an alarm. She'd hated the name at first, thought it was too dramatic, too harsh. But it had stuck, and eventually she'd worn it like armor. 5 minutes later, Margaret sat across from James Hartman in his private office. He was in his 50s, lean and scarred, with the watchful eyes of a man who'd spent too many years in dangerous places. "I'll be damned," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I heard you retired to some nowhere town in Virginia." "I did," Margaret said. "Now I need to remind that town who I am." She explained what had happened at the Legion Hall, keeping her voice factual and unemotional. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" "Information," Margaret said. "Dale Porter, Tom Bradford, and the rest of the men at that Legion post. I want to know everything about them. Service records, current activities, anything that doesn't add up." James nodded slowly. "You planning something illegal?" "No," Margaret said. "I'm planning something just." "There's a difference." "Always has been. You know that as well as I do." James smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. "I'll have what you need by tomorrow, but Margaret, be careful. These old boys' networks can be nastier than you think. They protect their own." "So do I," Margaret said. Her next stop was a gun range on the outskirts of Richmond. She rented a lane for 2 hours and worked through drills she hadn't practiced in years. Draw and fire, target transition, stress shooting. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind had almost forgotten. By the end of the session, her groupings were tight and her movements were smooth. The range officer, a former Marine, watched her pack up her gear with obvious respect. "You military?" he asked. "Used to be," Margaret said. "Looked like more than used to be from where I was standing." Margaret just smiled and left. She drove back to Pinewood as the sun set, painting the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of orange and red. Her house was dark when she arrived. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she sat in her living room with the black jacket on her lap and thought about what came next. Revenge wasn't the right word for what she wanted. Revenge was hot and emotional, driven by anger and pain. What Margaret felt was colder, more calculated. She wanted recognition. She wanted them to understand what they'd dismissed, what they'd burned. She wanted them to face the truth. The next day, James sent her a secure email. The attachments contained service records, financial information, and background checks on Dale Porter, Tom Bradford, and 5 other men from the Legion Hall who'd been present during the burning. Margaret read through everything carefully, taking notes. What she found didn't surprise her, but it gave her the ammunition she needed. Dale Porter had served in Vietnam, that much was true. But his service record showed he'd been a supply clerk, stationed safely at a base camp for most of his tour. He'd never seen combat. The stories he told about the Mekong Delta and losing friends were borrowed from other men's experiences, worn like stolen valor. Tom Bradford's record was more complicated. He'd been an Army Ranger, legitimately, and had seen real combat. But after his service, he'd been investigated for misappropriating Legion funds, money meant for veteran services that had somehow ended up funding his fishing trips and bar tabs. The investigation had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the suspicion remained. The others were a mixed bag. Some had served honorably. Others had exaggerated their service or hidden less than honorable discharges. But they all shared one thing: they'd allowed Dale to burn her jacket. They'd stood by and done nothing. Margaret closed her laptop and looked out the window. Her plan was forming, piece by piece, like a mission briefing coming together. She wouldn't confront them directly. That wouldn't work. They'd just close ranks and dismiss her again. No, she needed to show them. She needed to demonstrate exactly who Master Sergeant Margaret Hayes was, in a way they couldn't ignore or explain away. And she knew exactly how to do it. The Pinewood Veterans Day ceremony was 2 weeks away. Every year, the American Legion hosted it in the town square. There were speeches, a color guard, and a memorial service for fallen soldiers. The whole town attended. It was the biggest event on Pinewood's calendar, and Dale Porter always gave the keynote address. This year, Margaret decided, things would be different. She spent the next week preparing. She made phone calls to people she hadn't spoken to in years, former teammates, old contacts, people who existed in the world she'd left behind. Some were surprised to hear from her. Others acted like she'd never left. "I need a favor," she'd say, and then she'd explain. And because she was Reaper, because she'd earned their respect in blood and silence, they'd agree. She also visited the Pinewood Town Council. The secretary looked surprised when Margaret walked in. Women didn't usually attend council meetings in Pinewood, especially not military women who kept to themselves. "I'd like to request speaking time at the Veterans Day ceremony," Margaret said. The council president, a retired banker named Harold Chen, looked up from his paperwork. "The schedule is already full, Mrs. Hayes." "It's Master Sergeant Hayes," Margaret corrected gently. "And I only need 5 minutes. I want to honor a special group of veterans who don't usually get recognized." Harold hesitated. Margaret could see him calculating, trying to figure out if refusing her would cause more trouble than agreeing. Finally, he nodded. 5 minutes, he said, right before the keynote address. "Perfect," Margaret said. She left the town hall and walked through Pinewood's Main Street. It was a pretty town, she had to admit. Tree-lined streets, old brick buildings, a genuine sense of community. People here looked out for each other for the most part. They just didn't look out for her. That was about to change. Margaret spent the next few days in her garage, working on a project that would have seemed strange to any observer. She was building something, a display of sorts, using materials she'd ordered online and equipment she'd kept from her old life. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, peeked over the fence one afternoon. "What are you building, dear?" "Just a little presentation," Margaret said, not looking up from her work. "For what?" "Veterans Day." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "That's nice. It's good to see you getting involved with the community." If you only knew, Margaret thought. On the Friday before Veterans Day, Margaret loaded her truck with carefully packed equipment. She drove to the town square after dark and spent 2 hours setting up, working by flashlight, making sure everything was positioned exactly right. When she was done, she stood back and surveyed her work. Tomorrow, everyone in Pinewood would see it. Tomorrow, they'd understand. She drove home and slept better than she had in months. Veterans Day dawned cold and clear. Margaret woke at 5 a.m., just like she had every morning of her military career. She made coffee, did her stretches, and then dressed carefully. Not in civilian clothes, not in her burned jacket. She dressed in the black ops gear. The jacket fit perfectly. Beneath it, she wore tactical pants and boots that had carried her through missions she couldn't talk about. She didn't wear any identifying marks or patches. The uniform was deliberately unmarked, designed for operations where nationality couldn't be established. But she added one thing. On her chest she pinned a simple nameplate, HAYES. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was someone Pinewood had never seen. Hard, competent, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with capability. "Let's go to work," she said to her reflection. The town square was already filling up when Margaret arrived at 9 a.m. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children ran around the war memorial, a simple stone monument engraved with the names of Pinewood's fallen soldiers. A stage had been set up at one end of the square, decorated with American flags and bunting. People stared as Margaret walked past. She could hear the whispers, see the confused looks. The woman who'd been invisible for a year was suddenly impossible to ignore. Margaret made her way to the stage, where Tom Bradford and Dale Porter stood with the other Legion members. They were in their Legion caps and jackets, medals pinned to their chests, playing the role of honored veterans. Dale saw her first. His expression went from confusion to anger in an instant. "What the hell are you wearing?" he demanded. "My uniform," Margaret said calmly. "That's not a real uniform. That's some kind of costume." "Is it?" Margaret met his eyes and held them. "Are you sure about that, Dale?" Tom Bradford stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable. "Margaret, this isn't appropriate. The ceremony is starting soon. Maybe you should." "I'm speaking today," Margaret said. "The town council approved it. 5 minutes right before your keynote address." Tom's face flushed. "Now wait just a minute. We didn't agree to." "Check with Harold Chen," Margaret interrupted. "It's all official." She walked past them to the back of the stage, leaving them confused and angry. She could feel their eyes on her back, could hear Dale cursing under his breath. Good. Let them worry. Let them wonder what she was planning. The ceremony began at 10 o'clock sharp. The high school band played the national anthem. The color guard presented the flags. Harold Chen gave a welcome speech about service and sacrifice, the same speech he gave every year with minor variations. Margaret waited backstage, checking her watch, reviewing her mental notes. She'd prepared for this like she'd prepared for missions, carefully, thoroughly, leaving nothing to chance. Finally, Harold called her name. "And now, we have a special presentation from Margaret Hayes, a local veteran." Margaret walked onto the stage. The crowd was maybe 300 people, the biggest audience she'd ever addressed. She took a moment to look at them, these people who'd never really seen her, never bothered to look past their assumptions. Then she began to speak. "My name is Master Sergeant Margaret Hayes," she said. Her voice carried across the square, strong and clear. I served in the United States Army for 37 years. Most people in this town know that. What they don't know is what I actually did during that service." She paused, letting the silence build. On the side of the stage, she could see Dale and Tom watching her with growing alarm. "2 weeks ago, I brought my dress uniform jacket to the American Legion Hall. I hope to display it alongside the uniforms and memorabilia of other Pinewood veterans. Instead, my jacket was thrown into a burn barrel and set on fire." A murmur went through the crowd. People turned to look at the Legion members, who suddenly found the ground very interesting. "The man who burned my jacket told me it didn't belong there," Margaret continued. "He said I wasn't a real soldier. He said women in the military are just support staff, secretaries and cooks who stay safely behind the lines while men do the dying." Margaret's voice didn't rise. She didn't show anger or emotion. She simply stated facts, the way she'd been trained to deliver mission reports. "I want to tell you today about what women in the military actually do," she said. "Not because I need to justify my service, but because the truth matters. Because the men and women who serve deserve to be seen for who they really are." She gestured to the display she'd set up the night before, large panels with photographs and text, positioned where everyone could see them. With a remote control in her hand, she activated the screens and images began to appear. "This is Major General Linda Singh," Margaret said, pointing to the first image. "She commanded the Maryland National Guard and deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. This is Sergeant Leigh Ann Hester, the first woman to receive the Silver Star since World War II. She fought off an ambush in Iraq, killing 3 insurgents and saving dozens of lives." More images appeared. Women in combat gear, women in cockpits, women in leadership positions. Each with a caption detailing their service, their achievements, their sacrifices. "This is Captain Katie Petronio, a Marine Corps officer who wrote about her experiences in combat in Afghanistan. This is Staff Sergeant Reckless, a horse who served in the Korean War and earned 2 Purple Hearts. Yes, the military has honored a horse for combat service, but some people still don't think women belong." A few people in the crowd laughed nervously. Margaret didn't smile. "I'm showing you this because I want you to understand something important. Women have been serving in combat, officially and unofficially, for as long as there's been a military. They've been flying planes, defusing bombs, fighting in close quarters, and dying for their country. The only thing that's changed is that now we acknowledge it." She clicked the remote again. The images changed to show women in special operations training, faces blurred for security, but the intensity and capability unmistakable. "In 1991, I was recruited into a classified program," Margaret said. "I can't tell you the name of the program because it's still classified. I can't tell you exactly what I did because those missions are sealed. What I can tell you is that for 12 years, I conducted operations in places that don't officially exist, doing work that officially never happened." The crowd was completely silent now. Even the children had stopped running around. "I trained foreign fighters. I extracted intelligence assets from hostile territory. I went places where if I'd been captured, the United States government would have denied my existence. I did this work alongside men who were the best operators in the world, and I held my own. I earned my place." Margaret pointed to Dale Porter, who stood frozen at the edge of the stage. "That man told me I wasn't a real soldier. He claimed he lost friends in the Mekong Delta, that he knew what real sacrifice looked like." She clicked the remote again. Dale's service record appeared on the screen, his actual service record, not the story he told at the Legion Hall. "Dale Porter served in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970, Margaret read from the screen. "He was assigned to a supply depot at Long Bin, where he worked as a quartermaster clerk. He never saw combat. He never left the base. He came home with an honorable discharge and a handful of service ribbons that everyone who served received." Dale's face had gone white. People in the crowd were whispering, pointing. Tom Bradford took a step backward, as if trying to distance himself from what was happening. "I'm not sharing this to humiliate Dale," Margaret said, though that was exactly what she was doing. "I'm sharing it because it illustrates a larger truth. Some of the loudest voices about what real service looks like come from people who have never actually experienced combat. And some of the quietest voices belong to people who have seen and done things that would break most of us." She clicked the remote one final time. The screen showed a photograph she'd almost decided not to include, a classified photo that had been declassified just last year. It showed a team of operators in an undisclosed location, faces visible, weapons ready. And there, in the back row, younger but unmistakable, was Margaret. "This photo was taken in 1995, she said. "I'm the woman in the back row. The mission this team was preparing for is still classified, but I can tell you it succeeded. I can tell you we all came home. And I can tell you that I was there, doing the work, taking the same risks as everyone else in that photograph." Margaret turned off the screen and faced the crowd directly. "I didn't come here today for revenge," she said. "I came here because I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of women's service being dismissed or diminished. I'm tired of watching men who have never faced real danger lecture others about what courage looks like." She looked at Dale, at Tom, at all the Legion members who'd stood silent while her jacket burned. "I served with honor," Margaret said. "I sacrificed more than most of you will ever know. I earned the right to have my service recognized, to have my uniform displayed alongside yours. And when you burned my jacket, you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected every woman who's ever worn the uniform." The silence in the town square was absolute. Margaret could see tears on some faces, anger on others, shame on a few. Harold Chen looked like he wanted to sink into the ground. Dale Porter's mouth was opening and closing, but no sound came out. "I'm done being quiet," Margaret said. "I'm done accepting less than what I've earned. And I'm done letting people like Dale Porter define what a real soldier looks like." She stepped back from the microphone. Her 5 minutes were up. No one moved. No one spoke. The crowd just stared at her, at the display, at the proof of who she really was. Finally, someone started clapping. It was a woman in the front row, maybe 30 years old, wearing an army jacket. She stood up and applauded, and her face was fierce with pride. Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, half the crowd was on their feet applauding. Not everyone, some of the older men sat with their arms crossed, stubborn in their refusal to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed. But enough, more than enough. Margaret nodded to the crowd and walked off the stage. She didn't look at Dale or Tom. They weren't worth her attention anymore. As she descended the stairs, a hand caught her arm. She turned to find a young woman in Marine Corps dress blues, a sergeant, based on her rank insignia. "Master Sergeant Hayes," the woman said, her voice shaking slightly. "Thank you, just thank you." Margaret squeezed her shoulder. "Keep serving, make them see you." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret walked through the crowd toward her truck. People moved aside for her now, watching her with new eyes. Some reached out to shake her hand, to thank her, to apologize for not knowing, for not understanding. She accepted their words with quiet dignity, but she didn't stop walking. She'd said what she needed to say. The rest was up to them. Margaret drove home and changed out of her black ops gear. She folded it carefully and returned it to the locked case in her closet. That part of her life was over, truly over now. She'd made her point. She'd shown them who she was. What happened next was up to Pinewood. She made lunch and sat in her kitchen, eating a sandwich and reading a book, trying to pretend it was just another day. But her phone kept buzzing with text messages and calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She ignored them all. Around 3 in the afternoon, someone knocked on her door. Margaret looked through the peephole and saw Harold Chen standing on her porch, looking uncomfortable and nervous. She opened the door. "Mr. Chen." "Master Sergeant Hayes," he said, emphasizing her rank. "May I come in?" Margaret considered refusing, then stepped aside. "Coffee." "Please." They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd planned her Veterans Day presentation. Harold wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and stared into it like it held answers. "That was quite a speech," he finally said. "It was the truth." "I know, that's what makes it so powerful." He looked up at her. "And so devastating. Dale Porter is, well, he's refusing to leave his house. Tom Bradford is talking about stepping down as post commander. The Legion Hall is in chaos." "Good," Margaret said simply. Harold winced. "I understand why you're angry. What they did was wrong, but this town, we're small, we're close-knit. This kind of conflict doesn't heal easily." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "Mr. Chen, let me ask you something. When you heard that my jacket was burned, what did you do?" "I didn't know about it until today." "But if you had known, what would you have done?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Probably nothing," he admitted. "I would have thought it was unfortunate, but I wouldn't have gotten involved. The Legion runs its own affairs." "Exactly," Margaret said. "And that's the problem. Everyone in this town has been willing to let the Legion define military service, to let men like Dale Porter speak for all veterans. Nobody questioned it. Nobody pushed back. And women like me became invisible." "You're not invisible anymore." "No," Margaret agreed. "But it shouldn't have taken public humiliation to make people see me." Harold nodded slowly. "You're right, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry. The town council should have done better. I should have done better." It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret's anger, which had sustained her through the preparation and the speech, began to drain away, leaving her simply tired. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you," Harold said. "The town council wants to make amends. We'd like to create a new veterans memorial, one that includes all service members, men and women, combat and support, everyone who served. We'd like you to help design it." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And the American Legion?" "That's more complicated. Tom Bradford called an emergency meeting for tonight. I think there's going to be some changes in leadership." "Dale." "I don't think Dale will be welcome at the Legion Hall anymore. Not after what you revealed." Harold hesitated. "Some people are saying you went too far, that you humiliated him unnecessarily." "Did I?" Margaret asked. "He burned my uniform, Harold. He told me I wasn't a real soldier. He built his reputation on lies and other men's valor. I just told the truth about him." "I know, and most people agree with you. But there are always going to be some who think you should have been quieter about it, more forgiving." Margaret stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the quiet street. "I spent 37 years being quiet. I followed orders, kept secrets, did my job without asking for recognition. And when I tried to claim even the smallest acknowledgement of my service, they literally burned it. I'm done being quiet." "I understand," Harold said. He stood and set his empty mug in the sink. "The offer stands if you want to help with the memorial. And Margaret, for what it's worth, I'm glad you spoke up. This town needed to hear it." After he left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen and thought about what came next. She'd achieved what she set out to do. She'd made them see her, made them acknowledge her service. But she'd also fractured something in Pinewood's veteran community, exposed fault lines that had always been there but had remained hidden. Was it worth it? Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked at it. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. "Master Sergeant Hayes, this is Captain Jennifer Walsh, USMC. I was at the ceremony today. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan and came home to similar treatment from my local VFW. Watching you stand up today, it gave me courage. Thank you." Margaret smiled and saved the message. Then another came. "Ma'am, this is retired Army Captain Derek Chen. I'm Harold's son. I never knew there were women in special operations when you served. My daughter wants to join the military someday. Thank you for showing her what's possible." More messages came through. Women veterans thanking her. Young women saying she'd inspired them. Men apologizing for never questioning the narrative about women's service. Active duty soldiers expressing gratitude that someone had finally said what they'd been thinking. Margaret read them all, and slowly her exhaustion transformed into something else, not pride exactly, but a quiet satisfaction. She'd done what she needed to do. She'd told the truth, even when it was hard, even when it made people uncomfortable. That night, she got a phone call from a number she did recognize. It was James Hartman from Richmond. "You caused quite a stir," he said when she answered. "That was the idea. It's all over social media. Someone recorded your speech and posted it online. It's gone viral. Last I checked, it had 2 million views." Margaret sat down heavily. "You're kidding." "Nope, you're famous, Reaper. People are calling you a hero. There are hashtags and everything." "Oh God," Margaret muttered. James laughed. "Hey, you wanted to be seen. Congratulations, the whole country is seeing you now." After they hung up, Margaret looked up the video on her laptop. Sure enough, there it was. Female veterans' powerful speech exposes discrimination, with millions of views and thousands of comments. She read a few. "This woman is a hero. The fact that anyone ever doubted her service is shameful. I'm a male combat veteran, and I'm embarrassed that we've treated women like this. Master Sergeant Hayes deserves our respect and gratitude. My mom served in the Army and never talked about it. After watching this, I finally understand why. Thank you for speaking up." Not all the comments were supportive. Some people accused her of attacking a fellow veteran, of being divisive, of making everything about gender when it should be about service. But they were in the minority, drowned out by waves of support. Margaret closed her laptop. She hadn't expected this. She thought her speech would impact Pinewood, maybe shake up the local Legion post. She hadn't imagined it would spread beyond her small town. But maybe that was good. Maybe other women needed to hear it. Maybe other veterans needed to confront their own biases. The next morning, Margaret woke to find a truck parked outside her house. She recognized it immediately. It belonged to Tom Bradford. She made coffee and waited. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, Tom knocked on her door. He looked terrible. His eyes were red, his face haggard. He'd aged 10 years overnight. "Can we talk?" he asked. Margaret let him in. They sat in her living room, the same room where she'd kept her Black Ops gear hidden for so many years. "I'm stepping down as post commander," Tom said without preamble. "The executive committee voted last night. Dale's been expelled from the Legion, and we're changing our policies about who can display their memorabilia in the hall." "Good," Margaret said. "But I didn't just come here to tell you that." Tom looked down at his hands. "I came to apologize. What we did, what I allowed to happen, was wrong. You served with honor and we disrespected that service. I disrespected it by staying silent." Margaret studied him. Tom had been a real soldier, a real ranger. He'd seen combat and earned his place. But he'd also been a coward when it mattered, choosing the comfort of silence over the difficulty of standing up to his friends. "Why did you let it happen?" she asked. Tom was quiet for a long time. "Because it was easier. Because Dale and I have been friends for 40 years. Because confronting him would have meant admitting that I'd been wrong all those years about women in the military. And I guess I wasn't ready to admit that. And now I don't have a choice. You made it impossible to ignore the truth, and I'm grateful for that even though it's painful." Margaret poured him coffee. "What happens to the Legion Hall now?" "We're rebuilding, literally and figuratively. We're reaching out to all the veterans in Pinewood we've overlooked or dismissed. We're creating a more inclusive space, and we're going to properly honor all service, regardless of gender or role." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and set it on the coffee table. "This is for you." Margaret opened it. Inside was a letter, officially apologizing for the destruction of her uniform and inviting her to join the American Legion with a lifetime membership, all fees waived. There was also a check, reimbursement for her uniform, and an additional amount for pain and suffering. "We can't undo what we did," Tom said, "but we can try to make it right going forward." Margaret folded the letter and set it aside. "I don't want your money." "I figured you'd say that. We'll donate it to a women veterans organization in your name." "That works." Tom stood to leave, then hesitated. "Margaret, what you did in the service, the classified work, was it really as dangerous as you suggested?" Margaret met his eyes. "More. I saw friends die in ways that officially never happened. I did things that keep me awake at night. And I came home with nothing to show for it except some generic ribbons and the knowledge that I'd served something bigger than myself. So yes, Tom, it was real, it was dangerous, and it mattered." Tom nodded, his face grave. "I believe you, and I'm sorry I never asked before." After he left, Margaret sat alone and thought about forgiveness. She wasn't sure she was ready to forgive Tom or Dale or any of them, but she appreciated the apology. She appreciated the acknowledgement. Maybe that was enough for now. Over the next few weeks, Pinewood changed in small but significant ways. The American Legion Hall put up a new display case, larger than the old one, with space for memorabilia from all veterans, regardless of gender or branch of service. Margaret's charred jacket, what remained of it, was placed in the center with a placard explaining what had happened and why it would never happen again. Margaret worked with the town council to design the new Veterans Memorial. It would be unveiled on Memorial Day, featuring the names of all Pinewood veterans, living and dead, with special recognition for those who'd served in combat and those who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. Gender neutral, inclusive, honest. She also started receiving invitations to speak at other VFW halls, Legion posts, and military events around the country. She turned most of them down. She'd said what she needed to say, but she accepted a few, particularly those where she could speak to young women considering military service. One Saturday afternoon, as Margaret worked in her garden, a car pulled up to her house. A young woman got out, maybe 25 years old, wearing civilian clothes but with a military bearing that Margaret recognized immediately. "Master Sergeant Hayes," the woman called. "That's me." The woman walked over, nervous but determined. "My name is Emily Porter. I'm Dale Porter's granddaughter." Margaret set down her gardening tools and stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I see. I wanted to apologize for what my grandfather did, and to thank you." "Thank me." Emily nodded. "I enlisted in the Army last year. I'm in military intelligence. My grandfather was furious. He said women don't belong in the military, that I was making a mistake. I almost quit because of him." She looked at Margaret with fierce determination. "But then I saw your speech. I saw you stand up to him, saw you prove that everything he'd told me was wrong. You gave me the courage to keep going." Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen. "How is your grandfather?" Angry, ashamed, refusing to talk about it. Emily shrugged. "But that's his problem, not mine. I just wanted you to know that what you did mattered. It changed my life." After Emily left, Margaret stood in her garden and looked at the town spread out below her house. Pinewood was still small, still traditional in many ways, but it was different now, more aware, more honest. She'd paid a price for that change. She'd exposed painful truths, burned bridges, made enemies. But she'd also opened doors for women like Emily, created space for veterans who'd been invisible. Was it worth it? Margaret thought about the jacket burning in the barrel, about the shame and rage she'd felt. She thought about standing on that stage, finally being seen after years of invisibility. She thought about the messages from women veterans, the apologies from men who'd never questioned their assumptions, the change, slow but real, in how Pinewood understood service. Yes, she decided it was worth it. That evening, Margaret got one final phone call. It was from a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Master Sergeant Hayes, a professional voice asked. Speaking. This is Colonel Patricia Morrison, U.S. Army. I'm calling to inform you that the review board has declassified portions of your service record. Your work in the classified program has been acknowledged, and you're being awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal, retroactive to 2003. The ceremony will be at the Pentagon next month, if you're willing to attend. Margaret sat down, stunned. Yes, I'll be there. Excellent, and Master Sergeant Hayes, thank you for your service, all of it. After she hung up, Margaret walked to her closet and pulled out the black jacket one more time. She held it up, remembering the missions, the teammates, the years of silent service. She'd spent so long hiding this part of herself, accepting that her real work would never be recognized. And now, because she'd refused to stay silent, because she demanded to be seen, the truth was finally coming to light. Margaret folded the jacket carefully and put it back in the case. But this time, she didn't lock it. She left it where she could see it, where any visitor could ask about it. She was done hiding, done being invisible, done accepting less than what she'd earned. Master Sergeant Margaret Hayes had finally come home, and Pinewood, all of America, was finally ready to see her. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the Pentagon, surrounded by generals and dignitaries and fellow veterans. They pinned the Defense Superior Service Medal to her chest, and for the first time in her life, her classified service was publicly acknowledged. In the audience sat Emily Porter, wearing her Army uniform with pride. Next to her sat Tom Bradford and several members of the Pinewood American Legion, the ones who'd asked for forgiveness and meant it. Dale Porter wasn't there, but Margaret didn't need his presence or his approval anymore. When the ceremony ended, a reporter asked Margaret how it felt to finally be recognized for her service. Margaret thought about the question carefully. Then she smiled, not a bitter smile, not an angry smile, but one of quiet satisfaction. It feels like justice, she said, and it feels like a beginning, because there are thousands of women veterans whose service has never been properly recognized, whose sacrifices have been minimized or dismissed. My story isn't unique. It's just the one that got told. She looked directly into the camera. To all the women veterans watching this, the ones who have been invisible, the ones who have been told they don't belong, I see you. Your service matters. Your sacrifice counts. Don't let anyone burn your jacket, and if they try, make them face the consequences. The interview went viral just like her Veterans Day speech. But this time, Margaret was ready for the attention. This time, she embraced it. Because she'd learned something important. Silence might be comfortable, but truth is powerful. And sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't staying quiet.